During dinner, my husband whispered. He brought it in his backpack. Don't react. Some moments change everything. This was one of them. I should have known something was wrong the second David walked through our front door that Tuesday evening. His shoes were perfectly aligned on the mat, his jacket hung with military precision, and he greeted our 16-year-old son Jake with that careful smile I had learned to recognize over 18 years of marriage. The smile that meant he was calculating every word before it left his mouth. But I was too busy stirring the marinara sauce, too focused on getting dinner ready before our guest arrived. We lived in suburban Denver, in one of those neighborhoods where the houses all looked similar, but the secrets behind each front door were wildly different. Ours was a colonial-style home with cream-colored siding and black shutters, the kind of place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. The October air carried the smell of burning leaves through our kitchen window, and I could hear Jake upstairs in his room, probably gaming with his headphones on. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. That should have been my first warning. David moved around the kitchen with unusual quietness, checking the locks on the back door twice, adjusting the blinds so they covered every inch of glass. When I asked if he was expecting bad weather, he just shrugged and said he wanted to make sure we had privacy for dinner. Privacy. Such an innocent word that would soon feel like a threat. Marcus was supposed to arrive at 7. David had worked with him for 3 years at the engineering firm downtown, and they had become close friends. Marcus was single, in his early 40s, with the kind of easy laugh that made everyone around him comfortable. He had been to our house dozens of times for barbecues, game nights, and holiday parties. Jake liked him because he actually listened when teenagers talked, and I appreciated how he always brought wine and never showed up empty-handed. So when David suggested inviting Marcus for dinner on a random Tuesday, it seemed perfectly normal. Just 3 adults sharing a meal and catching up. At 6:55, I was setting the table in our dining room when I heard Marcus pull into our driveway. His Honda Civic had a distinctive sound, a slight rattle in the engine that he kept meaning to fix but never got around to. Through the front window, I watched him grab something from his back seat, a backpack, navy blue with worn corners. I thought nothing of it. Marcus always carried a backpack. It usually contained his laptop, some work files, maybe a book he was reading. He was the kind of person who liked to be prepared for anything. He knocked 3 times, his usual pattern, and David opened the door before the 3rd knock finished echoing through the house. They embraced briefly, the way men do when they are genuinely fond of each other, and Marcus stepped inside carrying that backpack over one shoulder. The October evening was crisp, around 55 degrees, and Marcus was wearing a gray sweater over dark jeans. His sandy brown hair looked like he had run his fingers through it during the drive over, and he had that slightly tired look of someone who had put in a long day at the office. But his eyes were different, usually bright and curious. Tonight they seemed focused inward, as if he was working through some complex problem in his mind. David took his jacket and hung it in the front closet with the same careful precision he had shown with his own coat earlier. Marcus kept the backpack with him, which was not unusual, but he held it closer to his body than normal. When I came to greet him, he gave me his typical warm hug, but his muscles felt tense, like steel cables under his sweater. We moved to the living room, where I had set out some cheese and crackers on the coffee table. The room was decorated in warm earth tones, with family photos scattered across the mantel and a large sectional sofa that faced our stone fireplace. Jake appeared long enough to say hello and grab a handful of crackers before disappearing back upstairs. Marcus placed his backpack on the floor next to his feet and kept one hand resting on it throughout our conversation. We talked about work, about the unseasonably warm fall weather, about Jake's college applications, all normal topics, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I could not quite identify. David kept checking his watch, even though we had nowhere else to be. Marcus answered questions with his usual thoughtfulness, but his responses were shorter than normal, more direct, and he never let go of that backpack. At 7:30, I announced that dinner was ready. We had spaghetti with homemade marinara sauce, garlic bread, and a Caesar salad. Comfort food that usually made everyone relax and settle in for a long, leisurely meal. As we moved to the dining room, Marcus picked up his backpack and carried it with him. When David raised an eyebrow, Marcus said he had some documents inside that he needed to discuss after dinner, work stuff that could not wait until tomorrow. Our dining room was small and intimate, with a rectangular wooden table that could seat 6, but felt cozy with just 3. I had lit 2 candles in the center, and the soft light flickered across the cream-colored walls. Outside, the streetlights were beginning to come on, casting long shadows across our front yard. Marcus placed his backpack on the floor beside his chair, but kept it partially unzipped. I could see the corner of what looked like a manila envelope sticking out of the top. We served ourselves and began eating. The conversation flowed more naturally now, probably because we all had something to do with our hands. Marcus complimented the sauce, asked for the recipe, and told a funny story about a client meeting that had gone sideways earlier in the week. I was beginning to think I had imagined the tension from earlier. Maybe Marcus was just tired. Maybe David was stressed about a project deadline. Maybe I was overthinking everything because I had spent too much of the day reading crime novels while waiting for my freelance editing work to come in. But then, as I was taking a bite of garlic bread, David leaned toward me. His voice was so quiet I almost missed it over the sound of our forks against plates. He brought it in his backpack. "Do not react." The words hit me like a physical blow. My hand froze halfway to my mouth, and I felt every muscle in my body tense simultaneously. The bread suddenly tasted like cardboard, and I had to force myself to swallow. Do not react. But how could I not react? My husband had just delivered what sounded like a warning about our dinner guest, a man who had been in our home countless times, a man we trusted around our son. I managed to put the bread down without dropping it, but my hands were shaking. I picked up my water glass and took a sip, using the motion to cover my shock and buy myself time to think. Marcus was cutting his spaghetti with methodical precision, seemingly oblivious to what David had just whispered. But I noticed that his free hand had moved to rest on top of his backpack, as if he was protecting whatever was inside. My mind raced through possibilities. What could Marcus have brought that would prompt such a warning? Documents? That seemed harmless enough. A gift? David would not whisper warnings about presents. Something illegal? That seemed impossible. Marcus was one of the most ethical people I knew, but David would not have whispered those words without good reason. In 18 years of marriage, he had never delivered cryptic warnings during dinner parties. He was straightforward to a fault, the kind of man who said exactly what he meant, and meant exactly what he said. I forced myself to take another bite of spaghetti, chewing slowly while I tried to process what was happening. The pasta felt thick and heavy in my mouth, and the marinara sauce that had tasted perfect an hour earlier now seemed too acidic. Marcus looked up and caught my eye. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something I had never seen in his face before. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear that made his skin look gray under the candlelight. Then he smiled, that easy grin I knew so well, and asked if I wanted him to open the wine he had brought. But I had not seen him bring any wine. My heart started beating faster, and I could feel sweat forming along my hairline, despite the cool evening air coming through the slightly open window behind me. Every instinct I possessed was screaming that something was very wrong, but I could not figure out what. David cleared his throat and asked Marcus about the Henderson project, their biggest client account. Marcus answered in detail, explaining technical specifications and timeline challenges with the same expertise he always displayed. Nothing about his words suggested any kind of problem or crisis, but his hand never left that backpack. I excused myself to get more water from the kitchen, needing a moment to collect myself and figure out what to do next. The kitchen felt like a sanctuary, bright and familiar, and safe. But as I stood at the sink, filling my glass with cold water, I realized I could see directly into the dining room through the pass-through window. David and Marcus were leaning toward each other, having what appeared to be an intense but quiet conversation. I could not hear the words, but their body language suggested they were discussing something serious and urgent. David kept glancing toward the kitchen, making sure I was not within earshot. When I returned to the table, both men immediately shifted back to casual positions and resumed normal dinner conversation. But the atmosphere had changed. The air felt charged, like those moments before a thunderstorm when you can sense electricity building in the clouds. Marcus asked about Jake's college plans, and I found myself giving rambling, detailed answers just to fill the silence and appear normal. But my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high and too fast. David finished his meal quickly and suggested we move to the living room for coffee. As we gathered our plates, Marcus once again picked up his backpack and carried it with him. In the living room, he placed it on the coffee table, directly in front of the sofa where David and I usually sat together. The backpack seemed to dominate the space, drawing attention like a magnet. I went to start the coffee maker, grateful for another excuse to leave the room and try to calm down. Through the kitchen window, I could see our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, walking her small terrier under the streetlights. Everything outside looked normal and peaceful, but inside our house nothing felt normal anymore. When I returned with 3 mugs of coffee, Marcus was unzipping his backpack. David was sitting rigid in his favorite armchair, his hands gripped tightly on the armrests. Marcus pulled out a thick manila envelope, the same one I had glimpsed earlier. His movements were careful and deliberate, as if he was handling something fragile or dangerous. He set the envelope on the coffee table between us and looked directly at me. "I think you both need to see this," he said quietly. His voice carried a weight I had never heard before, and suddenly I understood that whatever was in that envelope was going to change everything. David reached forward and placed his hand over mine. His palm was damp with sweat, and his fingers trembled slightly as they intertwined with mine. This was the man who had remained calm during Jake's emergency appendectomy 3 years ago, who had talked me through my panic attacks after my mother died, who never showed fear even when our basement flooded during that terrible storm last spring. But tonight, he was terrified. Marcus opened the envelope with surgical precision, his engineer's mind evident in every careful movement. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed unnaturally loud in our quiet living room. Outside, I could hear the distant hum of traffic on the main road, the normal sounds of suburban evening life continuing while our world was about to shift on its axis. From the envelope, Marcus withdrew a stack of photographs. 8x10 glossy prints that he placed face down on our coffee table in a neat row. His hands were steady, but I noticed a thin line of perspiration along his hairline. "Before you look at these," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you both to understand something. I have been watching your house for 3 weeks. The words hit me like ice water. Watching our house? I felt David's grip on my hand tighten, and my first instinct was to look toward the stairs, making sure Jake was still safely in his room. The sound of his video game music drifted down from the 2nd floor, a reassuring reminder that our son was exactly where he was supposed to be. Marcus must have noticed my glance toward the stairs, because he quickly added, "Jake is not in any danger. This is not about him. This is about someone who has been watching all of you." My mouth went dry. Someone watching us? Here, in our safe neighborhood where the biggest crime was usually teenagers toilet papering houses on Halloween? Marcus turned over the first photograph. It showed our house, taken from across the street, probably from the small park where parents brought their toddlers to play on the swing set. The image was crisp and clear, taken during daylight hours, but there was something wrong with it, something that made my stomach clench. There was a figure in our front window, someone standing in our living room, barely visible through the sheer curtains, but definitely there. The problem was, the timestamp on the photo showed it was taken last Tuesday at 2:15 in the afternoon. David had been at work. Jake had been at school. I had been at my book club meeting across town, discussing a mystery novel that now seemed far too close to reality. No one should have been in our house. David leaned forward, studying the photograph with the same intensity he brought to engineering blueprints. His face had gone pale, and I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice rough. Marcus turned over the second photograph. This one was taken from our backyard, shooting toward our kitchen window. Again, there was a figure visible inside, this time moving through our kitchen. The timestamp showed Thursday afternoon, another time when our entire family had alibis for being elsewhere. Someone had been in our house, multiple times, moving freely through our rooms, probably touching our belongings, maybe even going through our personal items. I felt violated in a way I had never experienced before. Our home was supposed to be our sanctuary, the one place where we could let our guard down and feel completely safe. The idea that a stranger had been walking through our kitchen, maybe sitting on our furniture, maybe even going upstairs near Jake's room, made me physically sick. Marcus continued turning over photographs. Each one showed the same pattern. Our house, taken from different angles, with evidence of someone inside, when no one should have been there. The images were taken over a span of 3 weeks, always during times when we had documented reasons to be away from home. Whoever was doing this had been studying our schedules, learning our routines, timing their intrusions perfectly. The 7th photograph made me gasp out loud. It showed someone standing in Jake's bedroom doorway, their silhouette clearly visible against the light from the hallway. They were just standing there, looking into our son's private space. My maternal instincts exploded into full alert mode. I started to stand up, ready to run upstairs and check on Jake. But David pulled me back down. "He is fine," David said firmly. "Marcus has been watching to make sure nothing happens to any of us." That is when the full picture began to come together. Marcus had not been stalking us. He had been protecting us. Someone else was the threat, and Marcus had discovered it. "I have been doing surveillance for 3 weeks," Marcus confirmed. "Taking photos, documenting times and patterns. Whoever this person is, they have a key to your house. They know your schedules. They have been inside at least 8 different times that I can prove. A key to our house. The implications sent chills down my spine. We had given keys to 3 people over the years. David's parents, who lived in Florida and visited twice a year, my sister Sarah, who lived in Phoenix and had not been to Denver since Christmas, and our neighbor Tom, who watered our plants when we went on vacation. David's parents were both in their 70s and barely managed their own daily activities, let alone cross-country travel for mysterious break-ins. Sarah was dealing with her own divorce drama and had not even returned my phone calls from last week. That left Tom. Tom Morrison had lived next door for 6 years. He was a quiet man in his 50s, recently retired from his job as an accountant. His wife had died of cancer 2 years ago, and since then he had become increasingly isolated. We tried to include him in neighborhood activities, and he always seemed grateful for the company. But now, I was remembering things that had seemed innocent at the time, but took on sinister new meaning. The way Tom always seemed to know when we were leaving for weekend trips, even when we had not mentioned our plans to anyone. How he would comment on details about our daily routines that we had never discussed with him. The fact that he had volunteered to help with yard work and small repairs, giving him opportunities to observe our house and habits up close. Last month, when I had mentioned that our kitchen faucet was dripping, Tom had offered to fix it. We had given him our spare key and told him to let himself in whenever it was convenient. He had returned the key the same day, but keys were easy to copy. The final photograph showed a clear profile shot of someone leaving our house through the back door. The figure was partially obscured by shadows, but the height and build looked consistent with Tom. Marcus set down the last photograph and looked at both of us with grim seriousness. "I called the police yesterday," he said. "They are opening an investigation, but they need more evidence before they can make an arrest. Breaking and entering is serious, but they want to catch him in the act to make sure the charges stick." That explained David's tension, his careful checking of locks and windows, his whispered warning about the backpack. He had known this was coming. Marcus must have told him about the photographs earlier, maybe at work, and they had planned this dinner as a way to show me the evidence in a safe, controlled environment. But why had they waited 3 weeks to tell me? The answer came to me immediately. They had been trying to protect me. David knew I would panic, knew I would want to confront Tom immediately, or pack up Jake and flee to a hotel. They had needed time to build a case and plan the safest way to handle the situation. I appreciated their intentions, but I was furious that I had been kept in the dark while someone was violating our home and potentially threatening our family. "The police want to set up a sting operation," Marcus continued. "They need your permission to install cameras inside your house and coordinate with my surveillance from outside. The goal is to catch him during his next break-in and gather enough evidence for a conviction. A sting operation, in our home." The idea was both terrifying and somehow reassuring. At least we would be taking action instead of just being victims. But first I needed to check on Jake. No matter what David and Marcus said about him being safe, I could not relax until I saw my son with my own eyes and knew he was okay. I excused myself and went upstairs, trying to walk normally despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Jake's door was slightly open, and I could see him at his desk, wearing his gaming headset and completely absorbed in whatever online battle he was fighting. His room looked exactly as it always did, controlled chaos, with clothes draped over his chair, textbooks scattered across his bed, and posters of his favorite bands covering most of the wall space. There was no sign that anyone had disturbed anything, but the thought that Tom had stood in this doorway, watching Jake's private space, made my skin crawl. Jake noticed me in his peripheral vision and pulled off his headset. "Hey, Mom," he said with the casual tone of a teenager who had no idea his world had just been turned upside down. "Everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I managed to say. "Just wanted to make sure you had finished your homework." He gave me the look that 16-year-olds had perfected over generations, the one that said, "Really, Mom?" without using any words. I did it during study hall, he said patiently. Is Marcus still here? I thought I heard voices downstairs. Yes, he is staying for a while. We are just catching up. Jake nodded and put his headset back on, immediately returning to his game. I envied his ability to exist in a world where the biggest concerns were completing missions and earning points. When I returned to the living room, David and Marcus had spread all the photographs across the coffee table in chronological order. Seeing them laid out like that, the pattern was undeniable. Someone had been systematically violating our home, and we had been completely unaware. The police detective handling the case is named Rodriguez, Marcus said as I sat back down. She specializes in stalking and harassment cases. She wants to meet with you tomorrow morning to go over the evidence and explain how the sting operation would work. Tomorrow morning seemed both too soon and not soon enough. Part of me wanted to grab Jake and drive to a hotel immediately, but the rational part of my mind knew that running away would not solve anything. If Tom was obsessed with our family, he would just wait for us to come back. Better to deal with the problem now, while we had law enforcement support and a plan. David squeezed my hand again, and I realized I had been staring at the photographs without speaking for several minutes. We are going to get through this, he said quietly. Tom is not going to hurt anyone. He is sick, but he is not violent. The detective thinks he is probably just lonely and confused since his wife died. Lonely and confused were generous interpretations for someone who had been secretly entering our home and standing in our son's doorway, but I appreciated David's attempt to frame the situation in less frightening terms. Marcus began collecting the photographs and returning them to the envelope. I know this is overwhelming, he said, but I want you to know that you are not alone in this. I am going to keep watching your house until Tom is arrested. The police will have unmarked cars in the neighborhood. Your family is going to be protected. As he packed up his evidence, I found myself studying Marcus with new eyes. This man, who I had known as David's easygoing work friend, had spent 3 weeks of his free time conducting surveillance to protect my family. He had given up his evenings and weekends, sitting in his car with a camera, documenting a crime that did not even directly affect him. Why? I asked. Why did you do all this for us? Marcus paused in his packing and looked directly at me. Because you are good people, he said simply. Because Jake reminds me of myself at that age. Because David is the best friend I have ever had. And because nobody should have to feel unsafe in their own home. The sincerity in his voice made my eyes well up with tears. In a situation that had made me feel violated and vulnerable, Marcus had been our guardian angel, working behind the scenes to keep us safe. David walked Marcus to the door, and I heard them talking quietly in the hallway about logistics for tomorrow's meeting with the detective. When David returned to the living room, I was still sitting on the sofa, staring at the coffee table where the photographs had been spread out just minutes earlier. How long have you known? I asked. Marcus called me at work on Monday, David admitted. He showed me the first few photographs during lunch. We have been working with Detective Rodriguez since Tuesday to plan the best way to handle this. 4 days. My husband had been carrying this knowledge for 4 days, coming home every evening and acting normal while knowing that someone had been secretly invading our home. I understood why he had waited to tell me, but it still hurt to know he had been protecting me from the truth. Are you angry? David asked, sitting down beside me. I considered the question carefully. Was I angry? Yes, but not at David or Marcus. I was furious at Tom for violating our privacy and making us feel unsafe in our own home. I was angry at myself for not noticing that anything was wrong. But mostly, I was grateful that Marcus had been watching out for us and that David had handled the situation with the police instead of confronting Tom directly. Not at you, I said finally. At the situation. At Tom. At the fact that we have to explain to Jake that our neighbor has been breaking into our house. We do not have to tell Jake anything until after Tom is arrested, David said. The detective thinks the sting operation could happen as early as this weekend. Tom seems to prefer weekdays when Jake is at school, but they want to catch him during a time when we can control all the variables. This weekend felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly soon. As we turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I found myself looking at our home with different eyes. The living room where we watched movies together, the kitchen where I cooked breakfast every morning, the hallway where we hung family photos. All of it had been contaminated by Tom's presence, but it was still our home, and we were not going to let one disturbed man take that away from us. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical October weather for Denver. I had barely slept, jumping at every sound the house made as it settled during the night, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows, every distant car door slamming in the neighborhood made my heart race. David had set his alarm for 6 instead of his usual 6:30, wanting extra time to walk through the house and check that everything was secure before Jake woke up. I watched him move from room to room, testing window locks and examining door frames for any signs of tampering. His methodical approach was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Jake appeared in the kitchen at 7:15, his hair sticking up at odd angles and his school backpack slung over one shoulder. He grabbed a banana and a granola bar from the pantry, his typical breakfast on the go, completely oblivious to the tension radiating from his parents. "You guys are weird this morning," he observed, looking back and forth between David and me. "Dad, why are you checking the windows? Did something happen?" "Just making sure everything is secure," David said with forced casualness. "You know how paranoid I get during storm season." Jake shrugged, apparently satisfied with this explanation. At 16, he had better things to worry about than his father's quirky habits. After Jake left for school, catching his usual ride with his friend Connor, David and I sat at the kitchen table with our coffee and tried to pretend this was a normal Thursday morning. But normal had been shattered the night before, and we both knew it. At 9 o'clock sharp, Detective Maria Rodriguez arrived at our front door. She was a woman in her early 40s, about my height, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp brown eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of our house as she stepped inside. She wore a navy blue pantsuit and carried a leather portfolio that looked like it had seen years of serious use. Marcus arrived 5 minutes later, carrying a larger manila envelope and a laptop bag. In daylight, he looked older than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had been losing as much sleep as we had. Detective Rodriguez settled into our living room with the efficiency of someone who had handled hundreds of similar cases. She spread her own set of photographs across our coffee table, including several I had not seen the night before. "Mr. Morrison has been entering your residence an average of twice per week for the past 3 weeks," she began without preamble. "We have documented evidence of 9 separate intrusions, always during times when your family was away from home. 9 times. The number hit me like a physical blow. Tom had been in our house 9 times, walking through our rooms, touching our belongings, maybe even going through our personal items." The detective continued, her voice calm and professional. "Based on the photographic evidence and witness testimony from Mr. Chen, we have probable cause for arrest. However, we would prefer to catch Mr. Morrison in the act to strengthen the case and ensure a conviction." Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up what appeared to be a surveillance schedule. He had been tracking our family's movements with the precision of a military operation, noting when we left for work and school, when we returned, when we went grocery shopping or attended Jake's soccer games. "Tom has established a pattern," Marcus explained. "He typically enters your house on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, usually between 1 and 3 o'clock. He stays for approximately 30 to 45 minutes each time." "What is he doing in there?" I asked, though part of me was not sure I wanted to know the answer. Detective Rodriguez consulted her notes. "Based on the positioning we see in the photographs, he appears to spend most of his time in your living room and kitchen. He sits on your furniture, goes through your mail, looks at family photographs. We believe he may be taking small personal items as souvenirs." Souvenirs. The word made my stomach turn. Tom had been collecting pieces of our life, stealing fragments of our privacy to take back to his empty house next door. "Has he been in Jake's room?" David asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. The detective shook her head. "The photographs show him looking into the bedroom from the doorway, but we have no evidence that he has actually entered. He seems to limit himself to the common areas of the house." That was some relief, but not much. The idea of Tom sitting on our sofa, eating at our kitchen table, examining our family photos was disturbing enough. Detective Rodriguez outlined the plan for the sting operation. They would install tiny wireless cameras in our living room and kitchen, positioned to capture clear footage of any intruder. Unmarked police cars would be stationed strategically around the neighborhood. Marcus would maintain his surveillance from across the street. When Tom entered our house, they would wait until he was clearly engaged in criminal activity before making the arrest. The operation was scheduled for the following Tuesday, Tom's most predictable day for break-ins. "We need your family to maintain your normal routines," the detective emphasized. "Go to work, send Jake to school, Do whatever you would typically do on a Tuesday afternoon. The more normal everything appears, the more likely Mr. Morrison is to follow his established pattern. Maintaining normal routines sounded simple in theory, but felt impossible in practice. How were we supposed to act natural when we knew our neighbor was planning to break into our house? How was I supposed to concentrate on work when I knew Tom might be sitting in my living room at that very moment? The detective and Marcus spent another hour going over details, backup plans, and safety protocols. They assured us repeatedly that Tom had shown no signs of violent behavior, that his break-ins appeared to be motivated by loneliness and obsession rather than malicious intent. But obsession could be just as dangerous as malice, especially when it involved a teenage boy. After they left, David and I spent the rest of the morning trying to process everything we had learned. We made lists of items we thought might be missing from the house, though it was difficult to identify small personal objects that might have been taken over several weeks. I realized I had not seen my favorite coffee mug in over a week, the blue ceramic one with the Denver Broncos logo that Jake had given me for Mother's Day 2 years ago. At the time, I had assumed I had broken it, or left it at work, but now I wondered if Tom had taken it as one of his souvenirs. David noticed that his spare reading glasses were missing from the kitchen counter, where he always left them after going through the mail. Again, something we had not thought much about until we started looking at our home through the lens of systematic theft. The violation felt complete and total. Not only had Tom been entering our house without permission, he had been taking pieces of our lives back to his own home. Somewhere next door, he probably had a collection of our belongings, maybe even photographs of our family that he had copied or stolen. That afternoon, I found myself unable to concentrate on my freelance editing work. Every sound from outside made me look up from my computer, wondering if Tom was watching our house, planning his next intrusion. At 3 o'clock, I called David at work. "I keep thinking about Tuesday," I told him. "What if something goes wrong? What if Tom realizes it is a trap and does something desperate?" David's voice was reassuring, but tired. "Detective Rodriguez knows what she is doing. She has handled cases like this before. Tom is not going to hurt anyone." But neither of us could be completely certain of that. People who broke into houses and stole personal belongings were, by definition, unpredictable. When Jake came home from school that afternoon, I found myself studying his face, looking for any sign that he had noticed something unusual about our neighbor. But Jake seemed completely normal, complaining about a pop quiz in chemistry and asking if he could go to a friend's house on Friday night. The next 3 days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. We went through our usual routines: work, school, dinner, homework, but everything felt hollow and strange. I caught myself checking the locks multiple times each day, even though I knew Tom had a key and our security measures were meaningless against him. Marcus called every evening to check on us and provide updates on his surveillance. Tom was maintaining his normal behavior, working in his yard, getting his mail, watching television in his living room. To anyone else in the neighborhood, he looked like a quiet, harmless retiree, but we knew better. Sunday night, Detective Rodriguez called to confirm the final details for Tuesday's operation. The technical team would arrive at 7 in the morning to install the cameras. David and I needed to leave for work at our usual times. Jake needed to go to school as normal. Everything had to appear routine and predictable. I barely slept Sunday night, my mind racing through everything that could go wrong. What if Tom noticed the cameras? What if he decided to skip Tuesday and come on a different day? What if he brought a weapon? What if Jake came home early from school and walked into the middle of the arrest? David tried to reassure me, but I could tell he was just as anxious as I was. We lay in bed, holding hands in the darkness, both of us staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about what might happen the next day. Monday crept by like a week. I made mistakes in my editing work that I had never made before, missing obvious errors and having to go back over documents multiple times. David called me 3 times during the day, just to check in and make sure I was okay. That evening, we had dinner with Jake and tried to maintain normal conversation. Jake was excited about an upcoming school dance and wanted to know if he could borrow money for a new shirt. The normalcy of his teenage concerns felt both precious and fragile. After Jake went upstairs to do homework, David and I sat in the living room where Tom had been sitting during his break-ins. The space felt contaminated, knowing that our privacy had been violated so thoroughly. "Tomorrow this will all be over," David said, reaching for my hand. I hoped he was right. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. The technical team arrived exactly at 7. 2 men in coveralls, who looked like they could have been cable repair workers. They installed 3 tiny cameras in 15 minutes, positioning them so carefully that I could barely see them even when I knew where to look. The devices would transmit live video to Detective Rodriguez's surveillance van, which would be parked 3 blocks away to avoid arousing suspicion. Marcus would maintain his position in the park across the street, using a telephoto lens to document Tom's approach to our house. At 8:30, David left for work, kissing me goodbye with more intensity than usual. At 8:45, Jake grabbed his backpack and headed out to catch his ride with Connor. At 9 o'clock, I locked our front door and drove to the coffee shop where I planned to spend the day working, trying to maintain my normal Tuesday routine while knowing that our house was being watched by multiple law enforcement agencies. The coffee shop was busy with the usual morning crowd, office workers grabbing caffeine before heading to their jobs. I found a corner table and opened my laptop, but concentration was impossible. Every few minutes, I checked my phone, waiting for word from Detective Rodriguez or Marcus. At 11:30, Marcus sent a text message. Subject spotted in backyard. Operation proceeding. My heart started racing. Tom was making his move. Right now, he was probably using his stolen key to enter our house, completely unaware that his every action was being recorded and that police officers were positioned throughout the neighborhood. I tried to focus on my editing work, but the words on my computer screen might as well have been written in a foreign language. All I could think about was Tom, walking through our living room, sitting on our furniture, going through our personal belongings while cameras documented his crimes. At 12:15, my phone rang. Detective Rodriguez. "We have him," she said without preamble. "Mr. Morrison is in custody. The operation was successful." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I almost started crying right there in the coffee shop. Tom had been arrested. Our home was safe again. Our family could go back to feeling secure in their own house. But the detective was not finished. "There is something else you need to know," she continued. "When we searched Mr. Morrison's house, we found extensive evidence of his obsession with your family. Photographs, personal items, detailed notes about your schedules and habits. This was much more serious than we initially realized. The relief I had felt moments earlier was replaced by a chill of fear. Detailed notes about our schedules and habits sounded like the behavior of someone planning something far more serious than simple breaking and entering. We need you to come to the station this afternoon to review what we found," Detective Rodriguez said. "Your husband is already on his way. Can you be here by 2 o'clock? I agreed and hung up, my hands shaking as I packed up my laptop. The nightmare was not over yet. The police station was a modern brick building downtown, surrounded by parking meters and busy streets. David was waiting for me in the lobby, his face grim. We were escorted to a small conference room where Detective Rodriguez had spread out the contents of Tom's obsession across a large table. The scope of it was breathtaking and terrifying. Tom had taken hundreds of photographs of our house, our cars, our family members. Not just the surveillance photos Marcus had documented, but images taken from multiple angles and at different times of day. He had pictures of Jake walking to school, of me grocery shopping, of David washing his car in our driveway. But the photographs were just the beginning. Tom had compiled detailed written profiles of each member of our family. My profile included my work schedule, my favorite coffee shop, the route I took to Jake's soccer games, even the type of books I checked out from the library. David's profile covered his work location, his gym routine, his usual stops for gas and groceries. Jake's profile was the most extensive and the most disturbing. Tom had documented our son's class schedule, his after-school activities, his friends' names and addresses, even his favorite restaurants and movie theaters. The level of detail suggested months of systematic surveillance. "This goes far beyond simple breaking and entering," Detective Rodriguez explained. "Mr. Morrison was conducting comprehensive surveillance of your entire family. We believe he was building up to something more serious." "What kind of something more serious?" David asked, though his tone suggested he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. The detective hesitated before responding. Based on similar cases, this type of escalating behavior often leads to direct confrontation or attempted kidnapping. Mr. Morrison was not just lonely. He was developing a dangerous fixation on your family, particularly on your son. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Tom had not just been breaking into our house to feel less alone. He had been planning something that could have threatened Jake's safety, maybe even his life. "We also found evidence that Mr. Morrison had been researching your family online," Detective Rodriguez continued. "He had copies of Jake's social media posts, school records, even medical information that he somehow obtained illegally. How long had this been going on? I asked, though part of me did not want to know. Based on the dates on his earliest photographs and notes, we believe Mr. Morrison began surveilling your family approximately 6 months ago, shortly after you gave him the key to your house to fix your kitchen faucet. 6 months. Tom had been watching us, photographing us, documenting our lives for half a year. Every family barbecue where we had invited him to join us, every casual conversation over the fence, every act of neighborly kindness had been feeding his growing obsession. I felt sick thinking about all the times Jake had been alone in our backyard or walking to school, completely unaware that Tom was watching him and taking notes about his activities. Detective Rodriguez continued laying out evidence. Tom had floor plans of our house that he had drawn with architectural precision, marking the locations of doors, windows, and furniture. He had copies of our utility bills, probably stolen from our mailbox, giving him information about our daily routines based on energy usage patterns. Most disturbing of all, he had what appeared to be a detailed plan for approaching Jake directly. Notes about the teenager's schedule, his favorite places to hang out, his friends' routines. The plan was incomplete, but it clearly showed that Tom had been working toward some kind of direct contact with our son. The detective assured us that Tom was being charged with multiple felonies: breaking and entering, stalking, theft, and illegal surveillance. The evidence was overwhelming, and he would likely face significant prison time. But the damage to our sense of security felt permanent. How were we supposed to feel safe in our neighborhood knowing that Tom had spent months learning every detail of our lives? How was Jake going to react when we told him that his friendly neighbor had been planning to approach him outside of school or at his favorite hangouts? We left the police station in a daze, driving home through familiar streets that now felt foreign and threatening. Every person we passed on the sidewalk could be another Tom, another neighbor with hidden obsessions and dangerous plans. When we arrived home, Jake was already there, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework. He looked up when we walked in and immediately noticed our expressions. "What happened?" he asked, his voice concerned. "You guys look like someone died." David and I exchanged glances. We had agreed that Jake needed to know the full truth, but figuring out how to explain it was going to be one of the most difficult conversations of our lives. "We need to talk to you about something important," David said, sitting down across from Jake at the table. As we explained the situation, I watched our son's face change from confusion to disbelief to fear to anger. Learning that someone had been watching him, photographing him, planning to approach him was a violation of his sense of safety that mirrored our own experience. But Jake was stronger than I had expected. After the initial shock wore off, he asked practical questions about the investigation, about Tom's arrest, about what this meant for our family's future. "So he is in jail now?" Jake asked. "Yes," David confirmed, "and he is going to stay there for a long time." Jake nodded, processing this information with the resilience that had always amazed me about teenagers. "Good," he said simply. "That is messed up, but I am glad Marcus figured it out before anything worse happened." Over the following weeks, our lives slowly returned to a new version of normal. Tom pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. His house next door was put up for sale, and a young couple with a toddler moved in 2 months later. Detective Rodriguez recommended that we change all our locks, install a security system, and consider counseling to help process the trauma of having our privacy violated so completely. Marcus became even more of a close friend to our family. His 3 weeks of surveillance had saved us from something potentially much worse than breaking and entering, and we would never be able to repay that debt. But the experience changed us in ways both subtle and profound. We were more cautious about who we trusted with keys to our house. We paid closer attention to the people in our neighborhood, looking for signs of unusual interest in our family's activities. Most importantly, we learned not to take our safety for granted. The quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen had taught us that danger could be hiding behind the most ordinary facades. Tom Morrison had seemed like a harmless, lonely widower who needed friendship and community support. Instead, he had been a predator whose obsession with our family could have escalated into something truly dangerous. 6 months later, sitting in our living room where Tom had once sat uninvited, I reflected on how much our lives had changed. We were still the same family, still living in the same house, still part of the same community, but we were wiser now, more aware of the fragility of the safety we had once assumed was guaranteed. And every evening, when David checked the locks and Jake said goodnight, and our house settled into peaceful quiet, I remembered how close we had come to losing everything that mattered most.